First off, I want to mention the Quali interview. I thought that was fantastic, man. I loved how much you guys dived into your career. It was really fun to get to know you. I've seen your work, over the years, but that was a fantastic interview. So thank you for taking the time to do that.
Not at all, man. My pleasure. Thank you.
Well, congratulations, on the release of Till Death Do Us Part. Can you tell us a little bit about the character and what ultimately attracted you to this project?
Groomsman number 4 was meant to be an antagonist within an antagonist. And the fact that he was a groomsman number 4 just made me giggle. It seemed to add to the mystery of the whole thing. I got a phone call from Timothy Woodward Jr., who's the director. He's a North Carolina boy. I'm a Carolina boy. And he said, hey, man, I know you're busy. I got this project that's a little crazy. I want to do something a little different. It's stylized. Read it and tell me what you think. And I looked at it and I said, well, I'm shooting Swagger for Apple right now, and I'm shooting Winning Time for HBO, and I'm shooting Abbott Elementary for ABC. I don't think it's going to be able to work. He says, well, I got a week right now. We're in progress. So, I mean, if you can get on a plane tomorrow, we could do it. And I was like, all right, book the flight. I'm on my way. And that's how I fell into it. And it was a blast from the moment I touched down.
That's awesome to hear. It's funny how things like that work out. You mentioned, all these other projects you're working on. This is a fully independent feature. How does that compare to working on, something you mentioned, or even compared to something like Drumline, Evolution, those bigger, larger projects?
More fun in some ways, right? It's a little bit more loose in some ways, and you have to be a lot more focused, right? You don't have as many people. There are no stunt people. It's going to be you. You're going to need to work it out. I enjoy independent filmmaking, right? I'm a fan, man. I started off a fan. I'm still a nerdy fan, and I never want to lose that. And I feel like doing independent work really kind of keeps me in that realm, because it's not about assistants and yes men and sycophants. It's about, rolling up your sleeves, creating a character, and doing the work. And, anytime a couple of country boys can get together with a Ukrainian lady and do something like this, I was like, yeah, man, let's do it. I enjoy that, and I really enjoyed the collaboration. And Natalie Byrne and Timothy are independent filmmakers, if ever there were. And it's just for, locking arms with people who love what I love is the best job in the world.
So you mentioned no stuntmen, and that got me curious. Did you and your castmates have to attend any martial arts training, or what was that process like? Because there is a lot of extreme moments in this film.
This was one of those films that's a lot like the way we did, Swagger. If you can't play basketball, you literally can't be on Swagger. That's actually the director's rule. You have to actually be a full-on player. I was a high school All-American basketball player. I got recruited at everybody. Professional sports is the family business. Every male in my family played professional sports. I am pretty adept at those things. I got a serious high kick. My punch is devastating. I'm fairly good at that. Natalie Byrne is incredible.
Yeah.
And all of the other groomsmen mostly make their living as full-blown stuntmen.
Yeah.
So they knew what they were doing, and also we wanted the intensity, right? We wanted that component. So when we weren't shooting, we were definitely working out with each other, stretching. Everybody was doing crazy stretches to make sure they had the fullest extension. So this was a lot of fun, and some real serious athletes on this one.
Yeah, some of my favorite moments actually came from you and Natalie, and there is a lot of physical elements to this film, but there's a lot of intensity as well. How do you remain intense? How do you bring the suspense to your role, and in films like this in general?
Whenever there's an antagonist structure, generally there's only one person bringing any sort of intensity, right?
Yeah.
When we talked about doing a double antagonist structure, and suddenly amongst the assassins and groomsmen, there's another guy going, "What the hell? Like, I'm not." It really gave us the ability to create tension on our side of the realm that had nothing to do with her, and it allowed us to vary the tension, obviously, with Natalie. I thought that was a really great idea when Timothy mentioned it, and it really is what created the character. And I kind of locked into, because it gave him so many places to go, because he really can't stand the best man, because that dude's an asshole.
Yeah.
He is a narcissist and he is a jackass. And I felt like the audience was probably going to feel that way about him. So it also allowed me to, in some way, be the audience at the same time. And that's, you don't expect an antagonist to be the audience, let alone the second antagonist. So it was just little things like that that I thought, make this different, make this more interesting, and make it sort of the type of storytelling that I tend to like to do.
Yeah, with this film, and both this film and Evolution, they belong to different genres, and I noticed looking through your IMDb, you kind of jump into everything. What draws you into these diverse roles, and how do you adapt accordingly? You mentioned that on this one you were on a flight the next day. How do you get in the zone? And then
Look, it's a skill I picked up at Mad TV, because on Mad TV you had to do multiple characters, and nobody asked you if you could do an impersonation. They just wrote it and you did it.
Yeah.
I tend to the character, right? Because that's the only thing I can control. I can't control the edit, I can't control the marketing, but the character I can control. And I don't like to do the same thing over and over again. I find it boring for me, and I always thought that would be boring for fans, right? And showcasing the ability to do different characters is my superpower. So that's the thing I like to flex. So I tend to choose things that fall out of genre and go a lot of different places, because they lend themselves to more interesting characters often. And I try and control the part I can control, which is what I do, which is my role. And I tend to choose that way, right? I chose Mr. Nancy because he was an African god. When was I going to get to play an African god like that, right? I chose Sleepy Hollow because, Frank Irving was a disciple, a real believer. You know what I mean? When am I going to get to play a guy like that, right? He was also a guy that was really about his guns. He was very clear. And so diving into that Southern military law enforcement gun culture type of guy who really wants to do the right thing, they talk about these guys as if they're all, horrible human beings, right? The duality of him not being that. So I tend to look for that. What's going on in pop culture? What are people tired of? Right now, it's everybody screaming at everybody. Everybody hates everybody. Doing things that can pull us together, to me, is the role of being an artist. So, I think this is going to be way more fun to watch than Barbie. It's going to be way more fun to watch than even Oppenheimer, because it's a thrill ride. It's fun. It's hilarious. It's horror. It's action. And I feel like that's, I feel like the machine is giving you what it always gives you. And these days it gives you a lot of the same thing. So I really just try and find stuff that's different and interesting, and hopefully grab, guys like us, who have the collections like I have and you have, and who really love this stuff, man. You know what I mean? We love it. We go to cons. We're about it. They think we're weirdos. You know what I'm saying? So I try and focus on that audience, because I am that audience.
Awesome. Yeah. Speaking of con culture, and, I want to switch gears a bit. You had to deal with some wild and, otherworldly creatures, in Evolution. How was that experience of interacting with the CGI and, practical effects in that particular film?
No, the mix of those things is always really key to me. And in this case, the creature creation was very, very heavy. What I loved about that movie is it was based on a scientific principle that what happened if evolution was sped up this way, and what would be evolving, and how might they evolve. And that creature creation came out of that. And I think it created a lot of really interesting, weird creatures, and a lot of them, particularly since one got pulled out of my ass. I got a real giggle out of the way Ivan Reitman approached that. And I learned something valuable from him, God rest his soul. And it was tone. He was so focused on, don't say that with so much bass in your voice, say that higher because it'll be funnier, and just what note to pick. And really a brilliant filmmaker and a funny guy, obviously responsible for Animal House and Twins and all sorts of stuff. But I learned a lot from Reitman, and it was such a fun film, and his character creation was really pretty amazing. And that was the early days of visual effects, right?
Yeah.
They didn't quite have all the tools, but somehow that movie never goes away. It's always on. People are always watching it. And somehow I've been fortunate to have like 5 or 6 movies that never leave television rotation.
Yeah.
And they make movies every day, but for somehow, Evolution and Drumline and Replacements and Office Space and, Double Take and Time Machine, they're like always on, and Bedazzled,
Yeah.
always on, always on. So lucky
Cla-
brother.
Classics. Yeah, I had to mention some Evolution just because that's one of my wife's favorite films, and yeah, it's like it's just one of the go-to films in my household. So I appreciate you jumping into that.
Of course. So tell your wife that 10 out of 10 doctors and nurses recommend lubricant. That's not just a joke. That's also a medical fact.
Well, yeah, she'll love to hear that. She's actually going to school to be a nurse, so that'll be
Get out of
fantastic.
here.
Yeah.
Every time I'm in a hospital, that's what happens, because the nurses come out and they're like, I say there's always time for lubricant every day. I think I'm more popular in hospitals than anywhere else in the world.
Well, to wrap up, I grew up, watching Mad TV, and I love your story about, you were a sitcom writer and you kind of got kind of pushed into this situation, and you ultimately got the role with Mad TV. That's, I guess, the short version of it. But what advice would you give to, screenwriters and people that want to make a living writing in that sense, because obviously you're one of the success stories, and I think that there's a lot that can be said about those particular fields.
Look, I think as a storyteller, there's two jobs. One is becoming part of somebody else's brain to try and write it the way they might have written it. And on a situation comedy in Hollywood, that's usually the job. Your job is to become a part of someone else's brain. But when you're writing your own stuff, you kind of get the chance to tell your story your way, right? And to focus on the parts that are interesting to you. To do that, because that's where Neil Gaiman and Stephen King and writers like that come from, right? I encourage people to not just spend your time in pursuit of having some Hollywood machine validate you as an artist or as a writer. You can make stuff with your iPhone, you can make stuff with your computer, and you can distribute it immediately. And if you have 10,000 hardcore fans that are willing to pay you $5 a quarter, I can promise you, my friend, you're in a $400,000 a year business direct to your pocket. And you might make more money doing that than you win in Hollywood, and you'll tell more interesting stories that affect people who live in your particular region and area, and then others get to come and discover that. I think this idea that there's this level of storytelling and this level, and you're somewhere down here because you haven't made to Hollywood, is complete bullshit. We're all the same storyteller. Audience is not really the thing that's most important. Authenticity to your story is what's most important. So I encourage people to do that and not focus your attention on the other stuff. Trust me, the audience will find it over time. I promise you they will. Office Space was a bomb.
Yeah.
Replacements was a bomb. None of those movies performed well at the box office, but somehow the audience, them, and they've been on rotation for 20 years, right? Whereas I've done other things that were super successful at the box office that nobody. How many times you watch Titanic on cable? Almost never. One of the highest grossing movies of all time, and you don't watch it again ever. Okay, you saw DiCaprio drown on an iceberg once, and you had seen it enough. But I think that's important to remember, right? We talk about these things as if they're all balance sheets and numbered, but I find myself just being attracted to little indie films and horror films that were made by non-filmmakers who I consider incredible artists.
Well, yeah, that's awesome. That's amazing advice. Thank you for your time. Huge fan. Here at CineDump, we let the doers know how they're doing. And Orlando, you are doing just fine. This was an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much, and have a good one.
Hey, you too, brother. Thank you for having me, man.